The week started with Sebastien defending his master's thesis on the very subject that we're presenting today. So I'll mainly, and we decided that we would be co-authoring a chapter for the book and presenting this wonderful presentation just for you today. So, oh, there's a clicker. So yeah, we'll go through this. Basically, I'll let Sebastien talk about his research work, and I helped him a little bit to frame this for today's presentation, but his research stemmed from the fact that basically the main question that we had is taking into account that the armed force, Canadian armed force, might not be as representative of the Aboriginal population as they are. What might constitute obstacles to the representation? We agree that there's an improving since 2010, I think, 2006, the first numbers, and the last 10 years there's been some improvement. Of course, now we have to reconsider these numbers based on the brilliant presentation of Dr. Leichenbauer, and that's the problem presenting after Leichenbauer. Sebastien.
So we chose a theory originally developed by Pierre Moscovici, which was the perfect fit for the objective of our research, which was aimed at describing the perception of a specific object, the Aboriginal people, by the military. So two main trends characterize the social representation paradigm, which it's the central core theory and the organizational principle theories. We will only use the central core theory because it's the one that was the most useful in our research in describing the object of Aboriginal people. So there's two components of the central core, the central core theory: the central core itself and the peripheral system. The central core has three functions. So it generates a meaning for the entire representation. It organizes the elements, the different component of the representation, and it stabilizes the representation in time, because once the representation about an object is formed, it's very hard to change it. That's the three functions of the central core, and the peripheral system is the other great component of the representation. Adapt the general abstract principle of the central core, because in a representation there are 2-3 abstract elements that are forming the core of the representation, but we have to adapt it to the concrete reality of the subject. So the role, the function of the peripheral system is to adapt this abstract principle to the reality of the subject. The peripheral system has also aims to diversify the content. So from a couple of abstract principles, we have a very concrete element for the subject. And finally, protection of central core, because it's much more easier to change an aspect of the peripheral system than to change an aspect of the central core. So that's the methodology. We'll not pass too much time on this. We'll skip to the research question, which was what are CAF members' social representation of Aboriginal people based on the core central theory, which elements constitute the representation system core central, and which elements constitute the peripheral system. So I had a couple. I had five topics and I asked the respondent what their perception about these topics, which are related to the Aboriginal in the Canadian force. So they're the CAF's role, affirmative action program, openness to intercultural exchanges, recommended integration strategy, and prejudices and stereotypes. So it is the graphical image of the result I had. So mainly I proceeded by the level of agreement amongst the respondent. It was pretty obvious. The CAST role was the core system because the respondent were pretty unanimous in saying that they would respect the legal authority, like the rank structure of Aboriginal people, and they're seeing also Aboriginal people through the excellence in terms of, it could be formulated too in terms of strategic contributions of Aboriginal people. So, and the other elements are also kind of hierarchical, because some elements, there was an agreement between military, and some other component of the representation, there was no agreement at all. So it was a lot of groups that had an idea about a certain subject, like the recommended integration strategy. Like there was no agreement among the respondents. So the central core, the two main tenets are in the statement of ethics on defense. So it's the core value that every military has to follow, whether in peacetime or in wartime. So legal authority is symbolized as the ranking structure in the Canadian force. It's also enshrined in the National Defense Act at Article 18. So, and all respondents were unanimous. They would respect the authority of an Aboriginal defense minister, and there was no doubt about it. The excellence is their strategic contribution. For instance, when they were asked about how they value the traditional knowledge, then they find it useful or very useful to the Canadian force, like the survival techniques, the orientation techniques, and it's consistent with the main, and it guides the remaining of the representation, like it's the lens through which the military are seeing the Aboriginal people, through these two elements. And I did not have time, but if I'm quite sure that if I would have reproduced the other element of the statement of ethics on defense, it would all have been in the central core too. So, and the peripheral system is based on the other component of the questionnaire, like valorization of cultural exchanges. It was the largest military agreement within the peripheral system, because it is consistent with the central core, because as long as they see the cultural, the traditional knowledge of the military through the lens of excellence, how could this knowledge help me reaching the goal of strategic contribution? So because excellence is the quality of policies, programs, and services they provide to Canadians and other part of the public sector, fostering and contributing to a work environment that promotes teamwork, learning, and innovation, providing fair, timely, efficient, and effective services that respect Canada's official language. So if we look at the other element, affirmative action program, it's less, there was not much of an agreement, because there is two conceptions of equality. Formal equality, which is the way by the public authority of treating all members of a group in the same way, and real equality, which is the way by public authority of treating every member of a group according to their rightful needs. the later conception opens the way to affirmative action program. However, there was more respondents who were proponents of the formal equality conception, even if there is also an important group of respondents that advocated the real equality conception. So they were divided, but most responded they was more in agreement with the formal agreement conception. And I think it's pretty consistent with the elements of the Central Core, particularly the legal authority principle. So the rank structure and the meritocratic culture in the Army influence the perception of the respondents. It is also consistent with the historic experience of Aboriginal, as my colleagues told sooner in the conference. When they enlisted in the Two World War, Indigenous felt like they were treated fairly and had access to better opportunity than they could in the civil society. But in turn, the consequences of this organizational influence is that the military are generally opposed to affirmative action because they perceive that they are perceiving that everybody must be treated according to his rank or his fulfillment in operation. So again, it's consistent with the tenets of the Central Core. So, however, the new defense policy enacts a real equality conception with affirmative actions. So it would be interesting to look at the perception of the military in 10 years. So where we could study the impact of this policy on the social representation system. So the third component is integration strategies. So there was no clear agreement on that aspect of the social representation system. The respondents were divided in three groups. So the proponent of integration by economic incentive, the advocate of attribution of constitutional power to the Aboriginal, and the adherents of assimilation. It was the least important group, but still there was quite few people who were adherents of assimilation. But when we cross these different schemes of perspective, like the recommended integration strategy, the three recommended, we found that the belonging to a group does not structure the representation. So, for instance, we thought that the respondents who were advocating the attribution of constitutional power would have less stereotypes, but there was no correlation between the belonging to a group and the existence of prejudices and stereotypes. One convincing explanation for the absence of agreement on the topic of integration strategies is the lack of historic knowledge or from the military on Aboriginals. They did not know, for example, the implication of the assimilation agenda behind the Indian Act. So the last component of the representation is prejudices and stereotypes. They were few, but distributed. So this tells us that the Army is not immune from this problematic, but again, I think that the element of the peripheral system are not structuring the general representation. It's more this element of the Central Core that are structuring the representation. So to conclude, there is a strong organizational structure, the strong influence of the organizational structure on military's individual perceptions, and I think it's more important than, for instance, in the private sector, or there's some study on the manager or their perception, the perception of the manager of the car or the toxicomany problematic, by example, and it was the organizational influence was less important than the military. Openness to intercultural exchange, so it's rather positive. Division of the military between advocates of real equality and formal equality, even if the agreement is more in the conception of formal equality. Gaps in historical knowledge, existence of prejudices and stereotypes, but there's a few, and it's an important element, but there's no differences in perceptual scheme between non-commissioned member and officer, because we had a question that made the difference to see if between these two major professional group in the army there would be a difference in the perception, because the officer have more education than the non-commissioned member, but there was no difference, so it's because of the strong organizational structure influence, I think. And finally, the perceptual scheme is not impeding the integration of Aboriginal in the CAF per se, but the existence of prejudices and stereotypes could undermine the integration process. But it would be very interesting, and I think the key, the answer or problematic of why there's an underrepresentation of Aboriginal people in the CAF would be best answered if we interview the Aboriginal themselves and the perception of Aboriginal people, their perception of the army. So that was it.